And I'm going to hand over now to Joe Phoenix, who, thank you for swatting, I'd left a sheet behind. Jo is a professor of criminology at the Open University, where she tells me that she actually has responsibility for 650 students. Yikes. She spent a lifetime researching prostitution policy reform, child sexual exploitation, and youth justice. Jo, over to you.
Wow, that's bright. I'll tell you anything. Anything. That's all right. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you also for allowing me to speak. One of the things that I want to talk about, for I am a reluctant speaker. I've tried to stay out of these debates for very nearly a year and a half, but there have been some events of late that have forced me out of my reluctancy and into the public. And what I want to talk about really is the effects that some of the campaigning and some of the logic that sits underneath the campaigning for trans rights has had on the freedom of speech, and in particular on academic debate. I believe at my core that academic debate, if that gets curtailed, then freedom of speech in the general populace will by definition be curtailed. For universities are the one place where we're allowed to ask and answer and argue every question, no matter how unpalatable those questions might be. So with that kind of preamble, I want to begin my talk by saying a little bit about who I am. I have the title Professor of Criminology, but that's not what you think, right? It's not forensic science. I don't go detecting crime. Not interested in that at all, really. I am a sociologist who has spent my career thinking through questions of justice, what it is, what we think about it, and how we produce it. Now, most of the time, I analyze the gap that exists between what politicians and politicos claim they are trying to do in the name of justice and how they construct the problem. Bear with me, we're going to have a lot of rabbit ears over the next few minutes. How they construct the problem that a change in policy will address. And I compare that with the lived realities of sexual violence, economic inequality, criminalization, and victimization defined or experienced by those who tend to be defined as both troubling and troublesome. So that's what I do generally. And what I want to do with you in the next little while, as long as Viv will allow me to chat, is to turn that sort of analysis to what I see are the contemporary contours in the politics of sex and gender that are going on at the moment, and in particular about the contest that seems to be taking place between sex-based rights and trans rights. Much of what I'll be talking about is not necessarily the claims made by any particular organization or any particular activist, but rather the effects of the sloganeering that is used to argue against single-sex safe spaces and sex-based rights. Now, the two slogans that are going to be the main theme for my talk are trans women are women, and trans people are the most oppressed, the most vulnerable individuals in society. Now, please remember, before I go on, and for the sake of the camera, my talk is not about what is being done per se out there in the real world, and that phrase will become important in a little bit, but rather the logic of how the problem of trans rights is being framed. Because in truth, I think the problem we have is that the logic that's being used presents some very grave risks at this moment in history, specifically at this moment in history, and it presents very grave risks for actual women and actual trans people. So I think we're seeing the logic split from what some of the real problems are that sit underneath. So let me be very, very clear. I absolutely, wholeheartedly support and stand side by side, it's going to sound contentious in this room, with my trans brothers and sisters in their fight to be free to express their sense of self as they will. But supporting that does not mean I support or even agree with how the problem is constructed. For me, the problem with how the problem is constructed if you follow what I mean, is that it is forcing us into what I'm going to call later on in the talk a reality game. And that reality game has extremely illiberal, conservative, and potentially anti-democratic effects. For the last year or so, I have been vexed by the claims being made by many people, academics and activists on behalf of trans people, around the notion that they are the most oppressed, the most vulnerable population in prison, the most vulnerable to victimization and hate crime, despite the fact that such things cannot be quantified. It is impossible to quantify those things. And I've been extremely vexed by what is being asked of us and of the challenge to sex-based rights. And I just want to pause for a second and remind everyone in this room, just in case you forgot, which I doubt, that those sex-based rights have been hard fought and won and exist as a direct result of the recognition of the structural inequalities that women and girls face in their everyday lives. Let me say it again. Sex-based rights exist to ameliorate structural harms. Right? They don't exist out there just because they exist. They exist for a reason. However vexed I was, though, I did not want to get involved in these public discussions about trans rights and women's rights because I could see that it was heading down a route of an irreconcilable dispute about the definition of womanhood, and thought that such a dispute served no one well, and it only acted to divide individuals whose experience, albeit in very different ways, and specific to the social context, whose experience of oppression and marginalization was based on normative assessments of their capacity to perform gender in specific ways. I just didn't want to get involved in that discussion. So I'm going to get involved in a different discussion with you right now. My reluctance ended, though, 2 months ago, when a conference at my university was cancelled. Just to remind you, I work for the Open University, a university that is open to ideas, people, and methodology, a university that is based on a social justice mission. But a conference that we were organizing with a man called Richard Garside from the Crime and Criminal Justice Society was cancelled. This was a conference that was meant to explore the potentialities and challenges of prison abolitionism. For those who don't know, prison abolitionism is a set of politics which sees justice best served by getting rid of prisons and the sheer human misery that they cause. That conference was cancelled because Richard Garside and the Crime and Criminal Justice Society was deemed by some activists and some academics to be too dangerous to associate with. Several speakers claimed that they felt compromised by sharing a platform with him. Activists threatened to disrupt the conference. Now, the question, why was Garside deemed so dangerous a person, and what was his offence? The offence was simple. His organization, he and his organization that he worked for, supported separate provision for trans women in prisons, or in the women's prison estate. Now, the irony ought to be obvious to all of you in here. Reluctant academics and prison abolitionist activists effectively shut the conference down to make a point based on a slogan: trans women are women. Now, for those of you who watch the news, this has happened now for a second time. Garside and the CCJS were co-organizing a conference on the links between the immigration system and the criminal justice system, something that's of grave concern to a lot of penal reformers at the moment. Speakers again felt reluctant to speak at a conference where there was a CCJS presence and where Richard attended. Now, a year ago, I was worried enough about what some of these politics would bring that I signed a letter to The Guardian questioning or raising the fact that some of the politics are foreclosing the space for academic debate. Now, nearly a year later, I think there's something else going on. The accusation of transphobia is enough to taint individuals, organizations, and it's enough to stifle debate about matters of justice far removed from the issue of trans rights. How did this happen, and how on earth did we get to this strange place in time? I think we got here because what is actually being asked of everyone in the name of justice for trans people is that we are being asked to deny difference, fact, reality, expertise, and knowledge. And if we do not, we are threatened with disruption and, as Richard Garside's case shows so well, banishment from our communities of professional practice. That's a very dangerous place for us to get to, regardless of the issues that got us here. So let me just pause for a second. I also think we have a really difficult path to navigate at the moment, because we have the gathering of the religious and the conservative and the far right out there. And of course, some of the gathering of the religious and the conservative and the far right is precisely against rights for trans people and other sexual minorities. You can see this in America. Over the weekend, Trump's laws about no trans people in the military came into effect. So we have some very grave forces on the right. And yet at the same time, we find ourselves as women and lesbians against what feels like at a time to be a full frontal attack on us as well. So, for a second time, and for the record, I do support trans rights, but the fight for those rights must absolutely be cognizant of the struggles against sex-based oppression and structural inequality. These two things are not commensurate. Trans struggles are at heart the struggle for individual personal liberation, to be free to express a sense of self, a sense of sexuality, a sense of their gender, and not suffer legal discrimination or violence as a result. But I'd argue that it is not transphobic to challenge the logic of the argument that trans liberation is only possible when and if social institutions, organizations, and individual people base what they think, how they are organized, and the policies and practices they adopt solely on an individual's sense of themselves. This is what is being asked of us when we are presented with the slogan, trans women are women, and therefore trans women ought to have the right of access to single-sex provisions, whether that's prisons, refuges, sports, etc. Please note, and I'm saying it again, I'm not saying that trans women ought never be able to access any of those services. There may be particular conditions, times, and places where that is appropriate. But what I am saying, however, is that such access should not be guaranteed or justified basically and only on an individual's sense of themselves, if you follow what I mean. But more, what the last year has demonstrated is that once we go down that route of basing policy on people's individual sense of subjectivity, claiming that anyone that challenges the oft-repeated slogans that are taking place of political discussion, we move immediately into a contest over the very nature of reality, fact, truth, and expertise. So do I have 2 more minutes? Brilliant. So let's just unpack some of those slogans for a minute. Is everyone with me, by the way? Do I need to modulate, change gears? You can hear me? Great. Okay. So let's unpack the logic of those slogans. To claim that in matters of law and policy, what matters most is an individual's sense of themselves denies the importance of the effects of the unequal social structures into which we are born. Now, that is always going to offend me as a sociologist, right? I can't help it. I like studying society. Telling me that society doesn't exist just makes me go back to 1980s and Margaret Thatcher. So that will always offend me. But it also offends me as a radical thinker. I'd like to think of myself as one. Because in denying social structure, it leaves the structural oppression, especially of class, race, and sex, completely unaddressed. In this new reality game, rabbit ears again, in this new reality game that we're playing, it seems that the only real fight is for the right of an individual to force organizations and social institutions to accommodate their ultimately mutable, changeable senses of their gendered self. For that was the one lesson we learned from second wave feminism. Our sense of our gendered self is mutable and changeable, and should be.
That's 2 minutes.
That is the 2 minutes.
That's a 2-minute call.
Okay, I still have 2 minutes. Great. I'm going to talk fast now. Now, sitting underneath this logic is another denial, and that is the importance of the external material reality, and I hesitate to use this word, facts. The slogans, trans women are women, are being used, not necessarily by many people who are supportive of trans rights, but by others, to say that trans women need to be accorded the same rights as women, things like rights of access to single-sex provision, and they are accorded this by virtue of how they feel. Beginning to repeat myself, so we're going to move on. To deny this is seen as being fundamentally transphobic on 3 grounds. Now follow me because the logic's convoluted. We are denying trans women their subjective reality. Right? Now that's what's actually meant by the other often repeated slogan, our existence is not up for debate. We are also denying the new reality, that biological fact and reality makes no material difference. And, relatedly, we are denying that there are no differences. This is why we are transphobic. They are denying that there are no differences, hence the insistence on difference becoming a ground for making the case that someone is transphobic, which is what Richard Garside got caught up on. Or to put it more contentiously, the only real truth, real being real here, being that which we must attend to, the only real truth is the individual's truth about themselves. Not external expertise, not evidence, not biological or social fact, not even the simple level facts that without science or medical intervention, generally speaking, people with penises don't get pregnant, and people with vaginas get pregnant with the help of sperm. Now, I'm saying that on purpose, because there is also another simple fact. There are single-sex prisons in this country in order to avoid the complications of what would happen vis-a-vis pregnancy and children if we had mixed-sex prisons. Oh. My time's up. I am literally just on the last page, so I can do this. Are you okay with me abusing your hospitality? You sure? Okay. All right, so imagine what would happen if Her Majesty's Prison Service had to buy bumper packs of the morning after pill, or forcing all women in a mixed-sex prison to take the pill. We get into some very complicated territory at that point. So forget about the predatory sex offenders like Karen White. Forget about the fact that there is absolutely no research or evidence of any kind out there that attests to what women in prison think about women, trans people, trans women in prison, the problems, the joys, the challenges. Or there's no research out there that actually systematically analyzes the problems and challenges that the prison service itself faces. Forget about all of that. And forget about all of that, because what sits underneath the sloganeering that masquerades as politics is the ultimate assumption there is no reality except what we claim, our individual selves, to be reality. Now, for me, I decided to speak up now because this reality game is perhaps one of the most dangerous games I've seen any so-called radical or progressive movement engage in. The reality game is the same game, or at least a very similar game, that has supported Brexit, the rise of Trump, and the rise and rise again of the far right across Europe. Let me be very clear. I am not saying that trans activists are anti-democratic or Nazis, just in case. I'm not saying that, or fascistic. But what I am saying is that the logic and the tactics bear remarkable similarity. Yet facts do exist, and it's important to remember them. In 2019, 22% of women live in persistent poverty. Of those women, it's black and ethnic minority women who bear the burden of poverty the most. The effects of 10 years of austerity politics has not borne down equally across the population. It's borne down on women, women, especially lone female families. 1 in 6 women will experience some form of sexual violence in their lives, yet the extent to which they are protected by the law will greatly depend on police and courts' assessment of them as good women. The Equal Pay Act for equal work, there has been no substantial change in the 50 years it's been in place. Attrition rates for sex-based crimes are getting higher for rape, domestic violence, coercive control, we're talking about 92 to 98% attrition. That means 92 to 98% of cases never result in a conviction. Women's representation across all spheres of life has not dramatically improved. So to wrap up, I will support my trans sisters and brothers in their quest for self-expression. On one level, the struggles that we as feminists and trans people face are the same, on one level only. But in the real world, where there are facts of a sort, in a very fundamental way, women's struggles are different than trans people's. It's as simple as that. The difference, the institutions and organizations of our society have been founded on the presumption of difference between men and women, and that is how and why biology truly matters. And the presumption has been and continues to be used to deadly effect in maintaining the oppression of women and girls. And I'll end there.
Fantastic, Joe. Thanks so much. Is there any chance of that going to be published somewhere?
Yes, it might be.
Great, great. Love it. Okay, next.